appreciate it very much. I have to apologize in advance the last couple of days. As you can tell, I've come down with a cold, so occasionally be blowing my nose. Eyes are a little watery, but nonetheless, I appreciate you putting up with me here.
Glad I gave it to you.
What's that?
I'm glad I gave it to you.
Thank you very much. As you said earlier, my name is Chris Irwin, Vice President and General Manager of the Irwin Automotive Group, just a few miles down the street in Laconia. We're a Toyota, Scion, Ford, Lincoln, and Hyundai store. We also have a Quick Lane Tire and Auto Center, as well as a body shop. And just to kind of give you a little bit of background about myself, very briefly, excuse me. I graduated from the University of Richmond in 2006, went to work for our stores in 2007. Obviously encountered a significant amount of turmoil in the general economy as well as the automotive space, starting in 2008, bleeding over into 2009, 10, etc., with the recession that we experienced. Nonetheless, obviously, I've learned a tremendous amount from that. I want to talk a little bit about, background about our stores, and then ultimately getting into where our industry as a whole is right now, where I see it going in the future, and some of the changes that have taken place within the automotive space, within dealerships, and specifically the skill sets that are now really necessary to not just survive but thrive in today's modern dealership. Again, to give you some background, my grandfather, I'm third generation. He started our stores in 1951, a Lincoln Mercury store. He added Ford in 1955. The late 70s, second generation, my father added Toyota. He added Scion in 2002. And I brought on Quick Lane, which is maintenance type oil change, minor repair business. I brought that on in 2010, and then in June of this past year acquired the Hyundai store. So that kind of gives you just a general sense, kind of the history of our stores and group, and kind of how we've evolved. During the last few years, we've been very fortunate in that we've been able to grow where a lot of stores, certainly have either gone out of business or have had to reduce their staffs quite significantly. I started in 2007, like I mentioned earlier. We had 75 employees. Right now, we currently employ about 115 people. So we've been very, very fortunate to add the jobs that we have been able to add to the central New Hampshire area. As I'm going to talk about, we've been able to do so because we've, in my estimation, been very progressive in the adoption of certain technologies to really be able to help our business grow and really thrive. I guess to get into a little bit of background into the automotive space and where we've been over the last few years, and ultimately where I see us going in the next 2 to 3 years. Traditionally, this country has sold 16, 17 million new cars on an annualized basis, year in and year out, prior to 2008. And obviously what happened there with the economy, etc. 2009 hit, 2010, our industry took a beating, to say the absolute least. 3 or 4 years ago, there were 22,000 new car franchises throughout the U.S. There are currently about 18,000. A lot of jobs were shed on the manufacturer side, dealership side, vendor side. And we were looking at an industry that was compressed to 10 or 11 million new car sales on an annualized basis. Obviously, that's a significant drop. And something that hurt all of us, and and ultimately made us right-size our businesses in a lot of cases, made us more efficient. But again, getting back to kind of the theme of what I'm going to talk about, there needed to be the adoption of new positions within dealerships that required a different skill set than anybody or that any dealer had currently of any of their employees, a different skill set than what they currently had. They had to go outside of the traditional hiring process within dealerships. Really looking forward, our industry is very much projected over the next few years to significantly outperform the general economy. This year we're probably looking at, I mentioned the number, traditionally we're used to 16 or 17 million new car sales. We got all the way down to the 10 or 11 million range a few years ago. Last year we were creeping back towards 13. We'll probably see it about 14 this year, so about another million units. This year over last year, which obviously is positive. It's not to where we once were, but nonetheless is certainly trending in the right direction. And especially if you look at, for example, the latter half of last year, the automotive space and the automotive sector, manufacturing really actually drove the general economy and drove GDP, quite a bit, and arguably may have inflated it a little bit higher than the rest of the economy. But really going forward, this year is projected to be a very positive year in the automotive business. For dealerships as well as manufacturers. Manufacturers have right-sized their business. When you look at manufacturers, whether you're talking about GM or Chrysler, who obviously came back from the brink of bankruptcy a few years ago, they're very profitable companies now. Ford, as profitable as they've ever been, because they've been able to right-size their business. So really going forward, I see, I mentioned maybe 14 million units this year on the new car side, another million over that the following year, and so by 2014, another million. So you're looking back at more of what we're used to as a normalized sales pace in the 16 million unit range for new car sales, and that's really going to be driven by some different factors out there. Obviously, gas can have an effect one way or another, but typically that is fairly negligible in that if gas prices are really high, then ultimately they're going to start to buy smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles, and vice versa. If gas prices stabilize or come down some, then people are erring on the side of SUVs and trucks as they have maybe historically. But there's a lot of pent-up demand out there for new vehicle sales. And that really stems from the fact that when you look at the average vehicle that's out there, the average vehicle that is out there is 10 years old, which is at an absolute all-time record. So to a degree, the hand is forced to buy new vehicles at this point in time. And so that's a little different scenario than what we've had over the last few years, where people have been fixing those vehicles. They now are at a place where, okay, it doesn't make sense to fix my vehicle anymore because I'm going to have to spend X. I might as well. Again, the hand is forced. And so, furthermore, one of the big things that really drives our business is credit availability. And whereas banks have certainly tightened over the last few years, which is fairly well documented, there definitely has been a loosening of credit over the last couple of years, and we foresee that banks being more aggressive going forward. So what does that mean to consumers? If you couldn't get a loan 18 months ago, you may be able to now get a loan for that new or used vehicle going forward. So those are really two predominant factors that will drive new car sales in the near future. And certainly we're very optimistic about that. Like I mentioned earlier, there have been a lot of cuts in our business in terms of jobs within dealerships, jobs within vendors, jobs within manufacturers, and we're really starting to see a lot of positive news, a lot of hiring, but at the same time, especially within dealerships, which certainly I'm the most familiar with, a lot of these positions, there's a little bit different skill set. Maybe a lot of the positions are titled the same, but there's the evolution of a certain skill set that's needed to really to really thrive in our business. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, I mentioned earlier technology and how we've been able to utilize technology to really help grow our business. One of the things that I certainly don't want to misconstrue is that within the dealership space and within a lot of businesses, I think that you see people getting too caught up with technology and you lose that personal touch to a degree. I think you can make that argument, and there still needs to be the realization that within my business, it's still very much a relationship business. It's a one-on-one, face-to-face business and transaction ultimately. I don't ever foresee the day that people just point and click online, I want to buy this $30,000 piece of metal, without actually talking to somebody about it, without test driving it. It very well may happen, but I'll probably be out of the business by that point. But nonetheless, we've been able to really utilize technology to grow our business in some fairly simplistic ways and in some very, what I would argue, very rational ways over the last few years. And one of those has really been with our used car business and the use of technology. We utilize technology, and there are a variety of vendors out there that do similar things to help price our used cars and merchandise our used cars. And what we've been able to do is kind of create a business model, I shouldn't say kind of create, we've created a business model where we're able to sell used cars to people, really all over the country. And a lot of that admittedly is done through price. But we're able to utilize, again, there are a number of vendors out there that do similar things, but a tool to help price our vehicles. And we can take a vehicle, and if we're looking at a 2010, I'm just kind of throwing out an example, if we're looking at a 2010 Camry LE, and our car has 20,000 miles on it, or 30,000 miles on it, whatever it happens to be, we can utilize a piece of technology to tell us, okay, my zip code's 03246 in Laconia. I want to look at 250 miles. I want to look at every car online that is similar in miles, year, and trim level to that Camry LE that's 2010 with X number of miles on it. And from that, we can actually determine a specific price for that vehicle. We can essentially make that vehicle move via price by basically, maybe for lack of a better phrase, undercutting our competition. And we've really been able to kind of hone that philosophy in terms of selling more cars, smaller profit margins, but ultimately better for our dealership. It's more of a holistic dealership type approach, because it really does drive overall gross to the entire dealership, but it's great for the consumer as well, because they're getting a very, very competitively priced vehicle, a very fair price in the vehicle they're paying, as opposed to, everybody in here kind of knows the stereotypical used car salesperson and arguably used car business in terms of, I own the car for X number of dollars and I'm just going to tack on $4,000 or $5,000 to that and hope that I get lucky with somebody stumbling across that car on our lot. To me, that doesn't make necessarily a lot of sense, and so we've erred on the side, and again, it's better for us as a store. We've really been able to grow our business. It's ultimately better for the consumer, where we're much more competitively priced, and as Chris can attest to, we sell used cars, for example, to people all over the country. We've had people fly in from out west to buy cars from us and drive them back. And these are not necessarily niche cars. These are pretty mainstream or more volume. They're not niche cars. So it's not like they're finding a particular Mustang that's really a big niche on our lot and coming to us for it. They're buying that 2010 Camry LE, from 500 miles away because of how competitively priced it is. But again, that's completely different from the traditional, for example, used car management, which is much more gut-based or much more intuitive. That still does exist, but again, the whole theme of my presentation is there's a little bit different skill set involved. It's embracing, utilizing technology, in really understanding a philosophy, and really being disciplined and abiding by that. Furthermore, along similar lines, we've been able to utilize another piece of technology that helps us show customers when they do come into our stores how competitively, for example, our used cars are priced. And we can take them right online. It's nothing that is created by us. It's a third-party vendor out there, and we can show them, using that example of a 2010 Camry LE with 20, 30,000 miles on it, whatever the case might be. We can show them where all those other cars are placed online and how competitively our car is ultimately priced, which is really very powerful and completely different from the negotiation process that we have traditionally had in the car business. And so it really is something that's worked out well for us. We call it, instead of, again, the traditional negotiation, it's more of negotiation by documentation. Customers feel a lot better about it, and ultimately they recognize and realize that they're getting a much more competitive price. And so some of the other things that we've really been able to some of the other things that have really worked well for us, very, very simple things. But again, it's a matter of, okay, well, how well do you ultimately utilize a piece of technology? Email marketing. We've really been able to, it's proven to have a tremendous return on investment for us. Likewise with a lot of dealers across the country if it's done properly. Very low cost, great return on investment. It's something that, again, is good for our customers, and certainly at the end of the day, do I like it? Absolutely. Other things along similar lines, use of social media, and whether that is an application like Foursquare or a blog or Facebook or Twitter, the list goes on. There are thousands of social media sites out there. I'm sure everybody in this room, for the most part, is probably on Facebook. And I refer to social media, or specifically really Facebook, as the primary driver. I call it social CRM, social customer relationship management. And what that's really allowed us to do is stay engaged with a portion of our customer base, and really be able to stay in front of them so that the next time they are interested in whether it's getting their car serviced, buying a car, or they've got a friend that's thinking about buying a vehicle, we're kind of top of mind. That's the whole idea. We're not trying to sell them anything, because that's obviously not going to work on Facebook. But when you start to break out, specifically something like Facebook, where, okay, the average user has 170 friends, and I'm sure a lot of people in here have many times over in terms of number of friends than 170. But nonetheless, when you start to break that out and see how that spiders, you can really stay in front of a lot of people by using something like, whether it's Twitter or Facebook. It can be very, very powerful, as long as you're providing some element of value, and by value I mean just engaging relevant content. And so, along somewhat similar lines, something that our store or stores have really gotten into over the last few years, which I think is critical for any business, is IRM, Internet Reputation Management. And we talk a lot about that, in that the way that I have described it to our people is that, if you're going to go buy a toaster, you're going to probably go online and you're going to look at reviews of, and it's just a random example, you're going to look at reviews of that toaster or the brand. Why aren't you going to do that when you're going to buy a $25,000 or $30,000 piece of metal? You are. And that's obviously, that's happening more and more as more people utilize the internet for shopping, whether it's a desktop or using a mobile device. And so what does your brand, what does your business, or in my case, my dealership, what does that look like online to customers? Ultimately, if you're going to buy that $25,000 piece of metal, you want to know who you're buying it from. And so when you start to look, and consumers do this all day long, they're looking at reviews of our stores or our competitors' stores, and you know, they kind of want to see how we stack up. You know, are we reputable? Do we say what we're, or do we do what we actually say we're going to do? You know, some of the various apprehensions that that people may have had in the past about car dealers, or some of the stereotypes that are out there. And so that's really become a big focal point of our business. There are a variety of different sites out there. Generally speaking, for any business, Google Places is by far, I mean, that shows up in the search results hands down above anything else. And my business, Dealer Rater, is a big site. You can kind of figure out that that ultimately is a site for car dealers. But there are a variety of other sites out there that drive online consumer reviews. So when we talk about internet reputation management, those are sites, whether it's like a Yahoo Local or a Bing Local, City Search, Judy's Book, Merchant Circle. There are a variety of different sites out there. But managing our online reputation and driving customers to give us online reviews has really been able to increase our business, and some of the best dealers in the country has really driven a lot of unprecedented traffic to our stores online. And it's something that any business is ultimately, for their own good, going to need to participate in. Because at the end of the day, typically those people who are most unhappy will go online and give those negative reviews. So you have to be proactive in your solicitations of those. So then, when we talk about, you know, ultimately jobs in dealerships in the automotive space, and I mentioned a different skill set than what we've traditionally seen. And some of these new jobs that are popping up, and you can give them all sorts of different titles, but whether we're talking about inventory acquisition managers, social media directors, digital marketing directors or managers, you can throw all sorts of words out there. These are all different positions that did not exist, for the most part, 5 years ago in our industry. These are, on the whole, positions that dealers cannot take their existing staff and blend somebody within their existing staff into that position. They don't have the skill set. It's not there. And ultimately, you see some of these positions being created in some of the most progressive dealerships throughout the country, and with absolutely phenomenal success. And so, you know, I mentioned inventory acquisition manager, used car market, very difficult to acquire cars. We have not had a lot of leasing over the last few years, with banks being as restrictive as they have been, and so you have a lot of, you don't have as many cars coming off lease, not as many new car sales as I mentioned earlier, so you don't have as many trade-ins. So what does that do? Ultimately, that impacts the price of the wholesale used car market. It's harder to acquire cars at reasonable prices. So now dealers are developing positions where, for example, you're in front of 2 or 3 computers all day long, and you're looking at online auctions all over the country. Because at the end of the day, if I can go buy the same car for $2,000 cheaper across the country than I can in my market in New England, I'm going to pay the $1,000 to transport it back across the country. It's a lot of work. It's something that dealers in the past, they've just gone to their local auction, they've raised their hand, they've put a bid down for a car, and put it on a truck, and let's get it back to the dealership. Almost a complete 180. Again, a lot more work, and again, a different skill set. than what traditionally has existed in new and used car dealerships. We talked a little bit earlier about Facebook, social media, social CRM, if you will, social media managers. It's not simply an update to your Facebook page or your dealership Facebook page once or twice a week or even once or twice a day. There's much more to it when you talk about all of the different social sites that you should be involved with, and how you're ultimately, what's the plan of attack for engaging customers, and ultimately down the road, hopefully turning those customers into really establishing a relationship and turning them into repeat and referral customers going forward. A couple other things that I mentioned, digital marketing managers or digital marketing directors, positions that did not exist in dealerships a few years ago. These are positions that they're going to be writing content for your websites to keep those relevant with respect to search engine results, search engine optimization, search engine marketing. These are all things that, for the most part, 5 years ago, dealers dabble in. Now, if you're not involved in aggressively pursuing some of these things, you're really going to fall by the wayside. You're going to get run over. You're going to become irrelevant. And so there's really a lot to the entire internet space, whether we're talking about, again, desktop or mobile, which, over the next 12 to 18 months, mobile will actually outtake or outpace, I should say, the buying of whether it's desktops or laptops. So a couple of other, I guess, more traditional positions within the car business, within dealerships, technicians and salespeople, and the evolution of, for example, technicians. It's a completely different ballgame than it was 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago. The cars are so advanced. There's more technology on these cars than, some of these cars have 6, 7, 10, 12 different computers on board. It's an incredible amount of technology. And then you take something like, whether we get into eventually, which we're starting to dabble in our industry right now, with electric vehicles or specifically hybrid vehicles, in the skill set that's needed ultimately to service some of these vehicles is completely different than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And so when we look at different automotive programs for technicians, whether it's something like what's here, you've got down in Concord, you've got the Automotive Youth Education Foundation. There's the T10 school. All the manufacturers have school. There's a tremendous amount of training that's involved in being a technician, especially to get to that B or A technician or master technician. A tremendous amount of knowledge that's involved, time that's needed to be spent. Vehicles are, again, very, very complex to work on. With all of the different, you think about something with 15,000 or 10,000 moving parts. It is, again, a little bit of a different ballgame than it was 10 or 15, 20 years ago. And then specifically, car salespeople. And what's involved with a salesperson now versus maybe, let's call it 10 years ago. And the evolution there that's taken place. And I've touched on that a little bit earlier, in that it's still a relationship that you need to build and maintain with customers, but how you do it might be a little bit different. Now you've got technology. You used to write stuff down. You'd have your book of all of your customers. I'm not saying that salespeople don't have that anymore, but now you've got CRM tools, customer relationship management tools, where you're able to really stay in front of your customers throughout the course of the years, so that at the end of the day, they think about buying their next vehicle from you, or throwing repeat or referral business your way. And so it's not necessarily the mentality of in the past where, okay, you sell a car and all right, I'm done with it, my hands are off. And if they come back to me, great. Otherwise, I'll just grab the next one. The space is far too competitive for that type of thought process. And at the end of the day, it's proven it just doesn't work anymore, like it maybe did back in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, especially when we're talking about 16 or 17 million new car sales versus the 13 or 14 we're at right now. You've got to scrap and fight a little bit more. But one of the characteristics that certainly I think a lot of more progressive dealers are going to, when they're looking for specifically salespeople, they're looking for somebody who, and I know I'm the same way, I'd rather have somebody who has no car business experience at all, and I'd rather train them from the ground up. That was maybe not the case when I first got into business several years ago. I'd like somebody who's well educated, somebody who has some sort of college education that we can ultimately train. Traditionally, our business has been kind of swapping salespeople from one dealership to the next. You kind of knew what you were going to get, and I don't think that that's a particularly good business model going forward. So we've really placed a premium on, we just want individuals who are well educated, well spoken, and who are receptive to training and learning, who want to learn. That really has proven itself to be a good business model for a lot of dealers throughout the country. Like I mentioned earlier with the used cars, there's less negotiation going on. Customers come into our showrooms and they know more about the cars than we do. Obviously, you can go online all day long. The average customer spends 6 hours of research or doing research before they actually pull the trigger and buy a car. They're armed with more knowledge in often cases than we are. Again, there's a little bit less negotiation, which in my opinion is great for the customer as well as for us. And it helps to also, to a degree, debunk some of the myths or stereotypes that are involved with salespeople and specifically our business. Along similar lines, you've got to have salespeople who understand and embrace technology. We talk about email marketing, we talk about even things as simple as, I'm sure everybody probably does it in here more than they do actually make phone calls, texting. But there are a lot of different ways ultimately to reach your customers, to reach out to your customers, and you've got to be well versed in doing so and be willing and able. And a lot of people in our business who are, let's say 40, 50, 60 years old, maybe are not willing to make certain changes with respect to some of these technologies that are out there and ultimately can help drive their business going forward. One of the other things that we really look for, I mentioned earlier with salespeople, education, and I specifically noted being well spoken. We see so much more of our business being driven through the phone for a variety of different reasons. One of them being 5 years ago in dealership operations, there was a big fear out there that everything would go to email, meaning customers would just email and everything would be done via email. People wouldn't walk in, people wouldn't call. It was just easier to email. Well, collectively as an industry, we screwed that up by not being transparent, dealers as a whole, by not being transparent with customers, by trying to, you could argue, maybe being sleazy, if you will, not answering questions transparently. It's really turned off a lot of people from email, and it's really resulted in an influx of phone calls coming into dealerships. In addition to that, obviously with 30–40% of the population out there having a smartphone, it's pretty easy. If you've got, again, if you're well invested in technology and have a very robust mobile platform, why don't I just hit the click to call button? It's a lot easier. I can get the answer that I need very, very quickly. So that's one of the other things that we really train and we really look at when we're looking at hiring salespeople. And so that overall kind of gives you a general overview of how our industry has changed, is evolving, where it's going forward, and ultimately some of, as I noted, the different skills that are involved. That most dealers do not, they can't take somebody from within their dealership and place them into some of these positions because they do not have the skill set. You have to look outside of the business. As I mentioned, we're still very much a relationship business or a relationship-based business, but being able to utilize technology to gain greater efficiencies, really ultimately has allowed my business to grow over the last few years, and certainly some of the more progressive dealers in the country have been able to really employ some of these tactics to grow their businesses as well. That is really all I have. Love to answer some questions, whether they're about dealership operations, the industry as a whole, kind of where we're headed. Would absolutely love to entertain some questions from anybody.
Where do you see the dealership going in, say, 5 to 10 years?
Where do I see our dealership going?
Yes.
That's a good question. I specifically see our group heading really. I've talked a little bit about the need for, not that family businesses, excuse me, are going by the wayside in any stretch of the imagination, but it's harder to compete with larger groups because larger groups, naturally, there's economies of scale, there are greater efficiencies. Granted, they might not be as nimble, but I've kind of envisioned, and hence why I'm bringing our Hyundai store basically down next to our Toyota and Ford store, which is alongside our Quick Lane. Everything is there. Everything is basically connected. I feel as though that's one of the first steps going forward over the next 4, 5, 6 years, to really being able to not just grow, but to create a very profitable business, and one that not only survives but thrives because of some of the economies of scale that we can utilize, as opposed to having one franchise under one rooftop in a small town. And so I see the need to really create efficiencies, again, through the use of technology over the next few years, but also the economies of scale is going to be so important in my estimation, to be able to spread costs around multiple franchises. It gives you a tremendous advantage over the single point store in a small town. And so, kind of a long-winded answer, but that's kind of what I've envisioned and actually written about over the last year or so, or year and a half. Because to me, it makes all the sense in the world going that direction. Chris?
You spoke earlier about using pricing very aggressively to to ship used cars throughout the country, and in fact internationally, Canada and what have you, and also kind of going off that your piece about social media, talk about the internet reputation. Would it be fair to say that we're kind of catching people's attention with the prices, but we're ultimately relying on word of mouth and online reputation to kind of drive the actual sale?
I mean, whether I'm going to drive 2 hours or I'm going to drive halfway across the country or fly halfway across the country, Chris makes a great point. They go hand in hand. So I see a price online with a vehicle that, especially a used vehicle, and there might be some uncertainty. Who am I buying it from? What type of condition is it in? Is it really worth the 4-hour drive or 5-hour drive down from Bangor, Maine? Just using that as an example. So I need to check out the dealer. And so then when you go online, and if you see that, okay, well, if you saw a bunch of negative reviews about that dealer, again, maybe they don't stand behind the used cars that they sell or whatnot, and you were able to do some research there and figure out, okay, well, maybe this isn't such a great idea. But on the other hand, if you then see sparkling reviews or a bunch of very positive reviews, it helps to put your mind at ease. It's a lot easier to make that 5-hour drive down from Bangor, Maine, to buy a used car. Just using that again as an example. So, yeah, the two go hand in hand, certainly. Yes. Yes.
I think car dealerships are a good example of how important presentation is and making the customer comfortable. Could you touch on like what you do, like to make the customer feel comfortable?
Sure.
What are good ways of doing that?
Absolutely. Well, I think that at the end of the day, actually more recently, especially take for example, Central New Hampshire. We don't need to have necessarily the physical showroom of a Taj Mahal like a lot of these stores are. Whether you look at a BMW or a Mercedes or Lexus store. But I guess the first element there is you just obviously got to have a clean, presentable facility. Take great pride in our facilities. And really believe in something that's clean and modern looking. Obviously, that's only one step of the puzzle, or one piece of the equation, if you will. You've got to ultimately have it comes down to your people in terms of traditionally, whether it's on the service drive or in the sales department, there's the stereotype of being pushy, being very aggressive, and so. I think ultimately you got to have your people very well trained, and then it also comes down to not just the presentation of your facility, but what type of point of sale material do you have within your facility to help maybe highlight, for example, those positive online reviews that you have, to help put people's mind a little bit more at ease, to help you seem more credible, and I think that all of that really. Helps to, again, put somebody's mind a little bit more at ease with whom they're doing business with. I think it only makes sense. Is that
Yes.
the answer? Great. Anything else?
How did you feel about the cash for clunkers?
That was an interesting time. Cash for clunkers for that 1 month was fantastic for our business, was fantastic for a lot of dealers. There was a lot of stress involved, whether or not we were going to get paid by the government. We had a lot of late nights. We had people at our stores till literally 2 and 3 in the morning at times. I think that as a dealer, the dealer body liked cash for clunkers. I think that overall, did it help out or really drive the economy, maybe for that 1 month. Overall, basically what Cash for Clunkers did was pull ahead new car sales that were going to be down the road. And it really gave the industry a shot in the arm, which arguably was really needed at that point in time. So from that standpoint, it was certainly beneficial. Again, like I said, there was a lot of stress involved, as we were all wondering how we were going to get paid, and there were a lot of different variables there. So it was great for car dealers as a whole. I don't know that it really helped, at the end of the day, just to be fair, really drive our economy for any point in time. I think it just pulled ahead some new vehicle sales that otherwise would have come, whether it was a month later or 3 or 4 months later. It made sense in the mind of the consumer to pull the trigger in August of 2009.
As far as new car sales, you mentioned that leasing was down with constricting credit and such, and it's kind of started to get better. Moving forward, do you foresee leases coming back to the extent that they had been, pre-financial crisis, or do you anticipate with longer warranties like on Honda, 10 years, 100,000 mile powertrain, kind of like a buy and hold mentality, just kind of run them into the ground?
I think that overall leasing is a great option for a lot of people. As a dealer, it is beneficial to the consumer if that's what they're looking for. Obviously, if you're driving 30,000 miles a year, you're not going to lease a vehicle. With interest rates where they're at, leasing makes a lot of sense for a lot of manufacturers right now. You're seeing leasing make a huge comeback, but part of that also stems from the fact that these cars are built so much. I don't care whether you're talking about a Ford, a Chevy, a Hyundai, a Kia, Toyota, Honda, whatever manufacturer. They're built so much better than they ever have been. The residual values are better, so they can offer more attractive leasing programs out there, more attractive payments, and so it's a good business model for manufacturers if they have the residuals. If those are not in place, for example, with some of the domestic automakers, the big three, Chevy, GM, GM, Chrysler, and Ford. 4 or 5 years ago, that wasn't the case. The residual values of some of those vehicles were poor, to say the least, and consequently, leasing did not make a lot of sense. And when those vehicles came off lease, manufacturers, for lack of a better word, were taking a bath. They were getting whacked each and every time. But going forward, I see leasing, at least over the next couple of years, continuing to build momentum, which it definitely has built over the last, let's call it 12 to 18 months, where manufacturers are really pushing leasing programs.
Hey, Chris,
Yeah.
have you heard any projections as to what market share electric vehicles will be in the future?
Well, it depends on who you talk to, but electric vehicles, we're not there yet, obviously, and they make up, it's not even close to 1% of new vehicle sales that are out there. I mean, right now you're talking about the Volt and the Leaf, and all the other manufacturers have electric vehicles that are coming. But it's such a niche, they're expensive. Right now the technology is not there. When you look at a vehicle, obviously Chevy had their problems with the Volt and there were some fire issues there. But you're talking about 3,000 or 4,000 sales a month with the Volt. With the Leaf, it's been a little bit more successful. Still, the technology isn't there. You bring a Nissan Leaf up here, you charge in this environment, in terms of just the temperature up here alone, let alone the driving conditions, you're good for maybe 30 or 40 miles on one charge, not the 100 that they promise you. That's in an absolute ideal setting. I don't see electric vehicles becoming a big part of our industry. I think eventually, certainly, they will be. But anytime in the next couple of years, it's not going to happen. The infrastructure isn't there, and really the demand is not there. Unless the government is subsidizing those vehicle purchases with huge credits, which, I mean, in the case of the Volt, I don't have a Chevy store, but 6, 7, 8 grand is what they'll help out ultimately there. It's still not driving sales. So you're still looking at whatever it is, $40,000 vehicle. And unless you're buying that vehicle right now as kind of a fashion statement or environmental statement, or a third car just to have, which a lot of people, especially in this still the economic times that we're in, are not doing. It just, right now, it doesn't make sense. I mean, that's the honest answer, honest truth. It's such a small, fractional amount of new vehicle sales out there. It will certainly increase, I think, going forward. The technology will become it'll become cheaper, but we've got a little ways to go. And it's just, there's no way for it to happen overnight.
What about Toyota's plug-in hybrid? Are they coming out with that
Yep.
soon?
Yep. That will be out, within the next couple of months. We'll see those land. But again, admittedly, not huge volume. And even when you look at, I guess I could draw the parallel between electric vehicles and look at hybrid vehicles. And the Prius, what that makes up of hybrid sales is the majority still. There aren't a lot of hybrids being sold out there other than the Prius. That is the predominant hybrid that's in our space that's selling for new vehicles. It still really, in a lot of cases, for a lot of consumers, does not make sense. Technology will get better, and certainly will